Never been there.
So, but now you can change it right to this guy.
We're good?
Isa.
What date?
One sec. Isa, not seeing it there. Though. I'm seeing a change here, but it's not changing.
Let me take over because everybody's touching the mouse.
אתה חוזר לישראל או נוסע לדובאי? ומה עם פסח? אתה חושב? כולו שלי תבוא לעשות פסח בדובאי. והתוכנית הכל יהיה בסדר.
It's changing here, but not changing there.
It's changing on the people's phone, but it's changing.
Sorry, all we're on the verge of getting going. Seems to be part of the process. People need to want it. Okay, there, that looks good. Okay, now let's see. Okay. Is this working on the YouTube? Are they seeing this? Are they seeing the page that says Mishnah Sanhedrin chapter 213? Okay.
Finish with the king.
Okay, no, we're not finished with the king. We're just getting going with the king. Okay, so good to see everybody. Apologize the technical little sort of glitch. Nice work. Okay, so but everybody's a lot of goodwill. Everybody's trying to make sure this goes smoothly. So
It's normal.
by July we'll have it done. No, we have an amazing staff here, so everybody's really trying to help. So what I want to try to do is to pick up where we were last time, but I want to see it inside with a passage here from the Tosafot. Because last time I didn't have the Tosafot, and here I'm seeing it over here on the screen. So Tosafot, I'll try to read it in the original. So it's where you see it says the second to last line. You can follow along in the Hebrew. If not, you'll V'hadnan Kohen Gadol Batar Perakama. And I gave you a rough translation in English here underneath. Mishum da'idi Tanya b'Perakama Mila Kohen Gadol Pasuk v'Sharilei. I don't want to do a word-by-word translation, but it's the issue we talked about last time. Why on earth is Tractate Sanhedrin shifting from the courts to talk about the high priest? And the answer to Tosafot is a more sort of technical and I find less satisfying answer. Tosafot said because because in chapter 1 of Tractate Sanhedrin, when it's talking about the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, it talks about jurisdiction of the Supreme Court Sanhedrin over leading officials, including the high priest. So it mentions the high priest. So then it says, let's round out in chapter 2 certain more laws about the high priest. And then it goes to the king. But the important pickup here, which I'm going to turn back to not immediately, but later on this evening, is it says, that's the words in the last line. it says after the high priest, it turns to the king. And it says that the king is chashuv mimenu. The king is more important than the high priest. So Tosafos, this is again the great Ashkenazic authorities. These are Rashi's grandchildren. We're talking about in France and Germany in the 12th, 13th century. So they are saying there's a hierarchy. If we want to use the terminology we used last time, I would say they don't say this exactly, but Article 1 is the court. And then they would say, who's number 2 in importance? Help me out. Who's number 2 according to the Tosafos?
Is it?
The king.
Oh, king is number 1, but we say.
Well, maybe the court's number 1.
Oh.
Then king. I don't know. You're right. It's not so clear. The comment that was made, I hope you heard on YouTube, I'll repeat, is that the courts are number 1, king's number 2. That's what Tosafos is emphasizing, and the high priest is number 3. The Tosafos are saying there's a hierarchy. So what I want to do is pick up on, last time we talked a bit about Article 1 about the court, and I want to focus on the so-called Article 2 or 3s. I'm not sure I'm going to follow Tosafos here about who's number 2 and who's number 3, but the idea is 2 other officials that occupy our chapter, the high priest and the king, and try to think more about how they relate to the court. We'll do that a little less tonight, but we'll get back to that. But also how they relate to each other. But I want to begin with an observation. I want to sort of go back now and just make an important observation that, you know, we could use these texts for a minute just to help us again. If you remember, the text in chapter 2 of Tractate Sanhedrin, the texts say, Kohen Gadol Dan Danin Meid Meidin Choletz V'Choltzin. So it talks about the high priest. And then the next Mishnah talks about the king. And we saw actually, according to the Mishnah, the king is exactly the opposite of the high priest. Let's leave that for a minute, or for more than a minute, for a half hour, the opposite. But the point is that we have court, chapter 1, and chapter 2, high priest, king. And Tosafos say, don't think the order shows hierarchy. Actually, it's the reverse. King's more important than the high priest. Okay, we'll leave the hierarchy for a bit. But the point I want to emphasize up front is that the king is not the high priest and the high priest is not the king. Okay, now maybe that's obvious to everybody. Okay, does everybody appreciate? There's a court. And then there are 2 other officials, which I'm loosely using this language of 3 branches. Right? 1 being the court, 2 being high priest, 3 being king, and then we're just confused who's really in second place or third place. But the point is the king and a high priest are different people. Now, is that obvious or not obvious? Thoughts?
Separation of state, good church
So
and state.
separation of church state, good. Maybe obvious in terms of our modern thinking, separation of church state. Of course, why did you say of course?
Of course.
Why of course?
So there are 2 different people.
Yeah, why of course?
Because it's the king is the king.
The king's the king and the high priest is the high priest.
High priest.
Okay, but do you want to marshal some evidence to support that?
Yeah, because they have 2 different.
They have different functions. The
Yes.
king does kingly stuff, royal stuff,
Doesn't-
state
doesn't-
stuff, and
the king doesn't go on Yom Kippur to pray for
okay,
us.
the king doesn't lead the prayers on Yom Kippur. That's the high priest. Okay,
But other religions don't have.
but sometimes in other religions they seem to be converge or conflated. Yeah,
Different populations to whom they administer.
they maybe they
it's not gonna
they
be
minister to
formal.
different populations. If we could see the YouTube for a second.
YouTube.
Let's see. I just want to see if the tech could just
All right.
help us with the YouTube for
This is
1
on
second.
YouTube?
Just 1 second. Let's see. No, I'll keep going forward. Okay, let me keep going forward. I'm not seeing the YouTube for a second. I hope everything's
You need anything?
live and well on the YouTube. Hold on. Let me just give me 1 second. Okay. Let's go back. Give me 1 second. Go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. So, okay. Let's get back to the PowerPoint. 1 second.
I recognize that.
Sorry, everybody. This is a little, we're trying to simultaneously be in a couple of places. So why is it not necessarily obvious? We heard other religions, but where else? Somebody help me out from Jewish history about high priest and king. Moshe, okay, but let's get more recent to the Mishnah. What history might be relevant? Sort of lurking a little bit.
David was not a priest, a high priest.
1 second.
Solomon was not high.
The king can't always be around
Okay.
because of migration and expulsion.
Okay, I'm hearing interesting comments, but let's focus on what's in the PowerPoint. In the PowerPoint, we see that these are coins from the Hasmonean dynasty. And Hasmoneans were what? They were both kings and priests, right? So the Hasmoneans actually wore both hats. In fact, over here, what you see on this slide is this is of the last of the Hasmonean kings. We have coins of the Hasmoneans. And it's interesting to look at the coins, how they refer to themselves. Do they refer to themselves on the coins as high priests or as kings? Everybody with me? I'm talking about the Hanukkah story, right? And in the Hanukkah story, what happened? Mattathias and his 5 sons, right, revolted against led the revolt against the Seleucids, and then eventually claimed autonomy. And when they claimed autonomy, actually even pre-claiming autonomy, they took over the temple, they recaptured the temple, and they officiated as high priests. And then over time, once they declared an autonomous Hasmonean state, Judean state, they also were the rulers. So the high priests were the rulers. And over time, they started to label themselves king. If you look at the coins, it's only the last of the Hasmoneans who literally on their coins had minted on one side of the coins, they had Mattathias. That's not the original Mattathias. We're talking about a descendant. Mattathias, the high priest and the council of the Jews. And on the other side, in Greek, King Antigonus. So, right, using 2 names in Hebrew on one side, Mattathias, Kohen Gadol, high priest, and on the other side, referring to himself as Antigonus, the king. So literally 2 sides of the same coin, literally, right? So that's very interesting that in Jewish history, now what are we talking about? We said mid-2nd century BCE. The Mishnah is redacted around 200 C. So we're talking about some 300 years before the Mishnah, which you might say is a long time before the Mishnah, but it's much less distant past than David, right? So it's actually fairly recent Jewish history. This is really the last of the kings. You know, then you have Agrippa, you have some other, Agrippa 1 and Agrippa 2, you do have some other kings afterwards, but this is pretty recent history. So in the pretty recent history, you actually had a king from the priestly line. So what I want to just briefly do, and I think that our Mishnah is asking us to do that, is to think, how is the Mishnah, if at all, reacting to the legacy of the Hasmoneans? Now, just to preface it with Jewish thought, actually later Jewish thought, medieval Jewish thought, if you look, hold on, I need to be able to forward. It's not changing on the screen. PowerPoint's not changing on the screen. Okay, resume slideshow, okay. Again, when I'm saying that, somebody's helping remotely, so that's the reason I'm saying it out loud. I'm not trying to air the struggles here. I'm trying to get help, and it worked. Beautiful. So you have here from medieval times Nachmanides, who says the following. Let's keep it brief. But Nachmanides, we're talking about 13th century northern Spain, just to situate the great Nachmanides. And he, in his comments on the Torah, he's commenting on the verse in Genesis. If you remember, there are blessings that Jacob gives to all the children, including to Judah. And what's the famous blessing to Judah? That the scepter shall not depart from Judah. So what's the meaning of that blessing? Says Nachmanides, let's read together. The scepter shall not depart from Judah to any of his brothers, for the king of Israel who will rule over them will be from the tribe of Judah, and none of his brothers will rule over him. In other words, the royal dynasty, royalty is the unique province of one tribe, Judah, says Nachmanides. What's the problem, which he's going to have to encounter in a minute? But that's not true to Jewish history. There were kings from other tribes, even in the Bible. The first king, King Saul's from a different tribe, right? So he goes on. In my opinion, the kings from other tribes who ruled over Israel after David went against the wish of their father Jacob by diverting the inheritance of Judah to another tribe. So he carves out Saul because he says Saul was pre-David. But once we get to David, then the line has to stick with David. So any king who ruled, says Nachmanides, and of course we know that in the Bible, there was a schism between the northern and southern kingdoms, and that's post-Davidic. So Nachmanides is saying from a normative perspective, the northern kingdom's problematic or sinful, just in its essence, right? In its ontology. Royalty belongs to Judah and Judah alone. So then he has to get to, and what about Hasmoneans? So what does he say in the last paragraph? This was also the reason for the punishment of the Hasmoneans who reigned during the Second Temple. They were saints of the Most High, without whom the learning of Torah and the observance of commandments would have been forgotten in Israel. And despite this, they suffered great punishment. So this is, I don't know if this would satisfy a historian, but seen through theological lens, Nachmanides says, why did the great kingdom, the great revolt of the Maccabees, of the Hasmoneans, and they established royalty. So why did it become a colossal failure over time? And theologically, his answer is because they were not destined for royalty. Royalty belongs to Judah, not to Mattathias and his sons, not to a priestly law. Now, this can be contrasted with Maimonides. Can we forward the PowerPoint? Not able to control it. Hold on, let me see if I can do it. Okay, there we go. So Maimonides says, again, he doesn't speak in so many words exactly to this question, but you definitely walk away with the impression from Maimonides. Maimonides, we're talking about 12th century, the great Maimonides. So he says, in his description of the Hanukkah story, and it's not Hanukkah time, so I want to abbreviate here, but he talks about the deliverance that of the Hanukkah, the background to the Hanukkah story, and he says, until the God of our ancestors had mercy upon them, meaning on Mattathias and the Judeans in their confrontation with the Greeks, delivered them from their hand and saved them from the Greeks. And then he says, the sons of the Hasmoneans, the high priest, overcame them, the Greeks, meaning slew them and saved the Jews from their hands, and they appointed a king from the priests, and sovereignty returned to Israel for more than 200 years. So what's the impression? Yeah, fair enough. Just 1 second. What's the impression you get from Maimonides? You don't be harsh to yourself, but what's the impression you get from Maimonides? He certainly doesn't sound like Nachmanides, right? Do you appreciate that? Maimonides does not go and say, and usurp the crown from the tribe of Judah. He seems to be celebrating this achievement of the rededication of not just the temple, but the reestablishment of royalty I was going to say among the Judeans, but that might confuse. So another Jewish royalty, but who's Jewish royalty? Priests. And he doesn't seem to blink about the fact that they're priests. Now, of course, Maimonides acknowledges, we're not going to go all into this, he'll acknowledge that David and his progeny are promised royalty, but he seems to be able to acknowledge or recognize or affirm the legitimacy of non-Davidic royalty too. Okay, so I'm just sort of fast forwarding. Where are we? We're going to get back to the Mishnah, but what I'm trying to show you is that the Mishnah is actually maybe unbeknownst to us, but that's what I want to draw attention to. entering into a bit of a charged domain, and that is the high priest and the king, can they converge, or are these different offices and meant to be occupied by different personalities? And what I'm trying to remind us is that actually the somewhat recent history prior to the Mishnah, there was a royal monarch, there was a priestly monarch, And in later Jewish thought, there seems to be a debate. Is a priestly monarch sort of, illegitimate just constitutionally? Or can you have a priestly monarch that's legitimate? Now, so far we've talked about priests trying to be kings, but do you have the opposite? You have the opposite of a king trying to be a priest? Do we have that in Jewish history? So there's one episode where this particularly looms large in the Bible, and that is here in this chapter in 2 Chronicles 26. So we won't read the whole chapter, but just a little bit. This is King Uziya. And King Uziya is one of the kings in the Bible, one of the later kings. Largely, he's described in the Bible as very favorably. So that's what we have over here in verse 4. Uziyahu was a righteous king. And yet, Chronicles critiques him. What's his great sin, this righteous king? That's verse 16. Ukechaskato gaval libo ad lahashchit vayimal b'Adonai Elohav v'yavo lachal Adonai laktir al mizbech haktoret. In his arrogance, he profaned God by entering the temple and by offering incense. And only following him came other priests. So what was King Uziah's ambition? Not just to be the king over Israel or Judah, but to be the high priest. So he invaded his own temple, or he walked into the temple and said, "I'm in charge. Go stop me!" Right? A little, Game of Thrones here type stuff. So he walked into the temple and led the cult.
But that says he was punished.
And exactly. And this text rails against it. It says that was his great sin, and it attributes it to his arrogance, and it calls it destructive. And then that's with a response in verse 18. And they say, Lo l'cha Uziyahu laktir l'Adonai ki lo kohanim bnei Aaron. Uziyahu, you've transgressed boundaries here. The cult, the temple, belongs to the priests, not to you. And Uziyahu gets very angry. Okay, you could imagine. He was a strong, powerful king. The verses tell us he did a lot of construction in Jerusalem. He was a very powerful king. So he's like, who are you to tell me that I can't do this? But so he gets very angry. That's verse 19. And then it says that he's struck with leprosy. God afflicts him with leprosy. And that's the story over here. And he dies in his leprosy. He's a leper till his last day, according to the account of Chronicles.
What was his
So,
lineage?
say it again.
What was his lineage?
He's Judah.
He was Judah, but
Yeah.
he wasn't he entitled?
No, because he's not a priest.
But he was from, was it Judah who created the line of high priests?
No,
I don't remember.
no, it's Levites. It's Levites. Okay, so let me just summarize to make sure we're all on the same page. Sanhedrin chapter 2, we're moving from the courts to king and high priest. And I want to pause for a minute, or for a unit here, part of tonight, to think about what's the relationship of king and high priest. In the Mishnah, they're different figures, and I'm just asking: is that obvious? Are they obviously distinct branches? And all of us went along and said, sure, they're distinct branches, and I'm with you. That makes sense, but it's not entirely obvious. In Jewish history, there were priests who were monarchs, and we're not sure what to make of that union. Is it problematic or not? Certainly some see it as problematic, and others seem to allow for that. And we also have sort of the reverse dynamic. We have a king who tries to officiate. By the way, think of who establishes the temple. It's always the king who establishes the temple, right? Who builds the temple? David wants to build a temple. Solomon builds the temple, right? So kings do have a link to the temple. So it's not so surprising that they might want to go the next yard and actually officiate in the cult. And we have a story like this. We have a biblical story of Uziya officiates in the cult. By the way, of course, I'm speaking in the biblical or the Jewish context, but we know these dynamics throughout Western history, right? If you think about the Roman emperor and his relationship to, once Constantine, once the Roman emperor converts, what is the relationship between the emperor and the church? Once Charlemagne becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, what's his standing? And then what's the relationship or you think of King Henry and his breaking away within, head of the Anglican Church. So this is a dynamic that pervades the world history, and we know it from Western history, and it has traces in biblical history, and a little bit, I think, relates to that larger question that was, or issue that was flagged about the relationship between church and state. And we can imagine within a religious tradition that it might be tempting to actually unify church and state through one organ or one institution or one persona. I mean, think about the idea of a Messiah, right? Which is certainly an important part of our tradition. Do we think of the Messiah just as, oh, he'll be in charge, or assuming he, right, a king will be in charge of the state, or will the, King Messiah be the spiritual head? And there certainly are some accounts, if you look in Isaiah in some places, and certainly in certain elaborations in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where the Messiah is not just a political leader, he's a spiritual leader, and it's one person, So it's certainly plausible that, at least an ideal, because we're learning Tractate Sanhedrin, and at least I'm trying to suggest this is a sort of idyllic account of Jewish politics. So I think we should pause and reflect that it's not obvious that there should be individuation and differentiation. And it certainly would have been plausible that there should be a more uniform or monolithic account or unicameral account, if you will, of rule. Let's just see another couple of sources, and then people want to comment. So here there's a fascinating Yerushalmi, okay, which is relevant. The Yerushalmi is the Jerusalem Talmud, and the Jerusalem Talmud talks about, I want to just double check how we're doing in YouTube. Okay, I'm sorry, I see there are all sorts of chats. Let me just peek at the chats if I can. Okay, I'm going to go back to the slideshow. I'll try to look at the chats in a bit. So in Yerushalmi, in Horiot, this is, so just when is the Yerushalmi? Just along the way, I want to always try to help contextualize, because it's always good to review. So the Mishnah is around 200 CE. Then after the Mishnah, you have Talmuds both in Palestine or Jerusalem and in Babylon. What's known as the Jerusalem Talmud or the Palestinian Talmud, it's called by both names in English. In Hebrew, it's called the Yerushalmi, is basically edited around the year 400 CE. Okay, and the Babylonian Talmud is edited later. So the Jerusalem Talmud actually is more challenging. It's more difficult. Believe it, I'm sure everybody in the room who's learned any Babylonian Talmud knows it's plenty challenging. But Jerusalem Talmud's even more challenging because it was less studied. Okay, all that's just background. So now let's look at the Jerusalem Talmud here. It says the following: Ein moshchin melachim kohanim. One cannot, it's literally related to our issue. One cannot anoint a priestly king. Priest cannot be a king, meaning trouble for the Hasmoneans, right? This is not such a neutral Yerushalmi. It's not just some abstract halachic issue. The Yerushalmi, let's say this is a 3rd century, 4th century teaching. It's saying that the Hasmoneans was problematic. Priests cannot be kings. And now there's an interesting debate. Why? So according to one rabbi, sage, Amora, Rabbi Yudan, so Rabbi Yudan says, Rabbi Yehuda and Turya in English says, why? Based on that verse from Genesis. Al Shem, because of the verse in Genesis, Lo Yasur Shevet Yehuda. Okay? Because monarchy belongs to Judah, as opposed to another explanation that concurs that priests can't be kings, but gives a different rationale. And that's Reb Chia, son of Ada. So Reb Chia, son of Rabbi Abba, says, based on a different verse. The verse says, "The man yarich yamim ha'malchto hu v'na b'kerev Yisrael." It talks about that there should be a long-lasting monarchy, and what's approximate immediately afterwards? Lo yeh lekohanim haLeviyim. This is again, if we open up the text, you would see that this is sort of a rabbinic exegesis. This isn't a simple reading. But it says, if you look in Deuteronomy 17, it talks about monarchy, and then Deuteronomy 18 begins with the words, not the priests. Now, the continuation means not about the priests should have certain shares in the priest, So this isn't a pshat. This isn't a simple reading. This is a rabbinic midrash. It's an exegesis. But in exegesis, what do they say? Monarchy, not priestly Levites. So what's the difference between these two explanations? What's the difference? There's a debate, but they both concur that you can have a priestly king. So what's the difference between them? They have different sources, but is there a difference between, not just that one points to one verse in Genesis, another points to a verse in Deuteronomy? Is there a substantive difference?
Go back to the other one.
They're both here.
Oh,
No, they're both here.
Well, this is obvious. The scepter shall not depart from Judah.
Okay,
But
one verse is more obvious, another one.
one.
Okay, one's more roundabout, one's more obvious. But aside from that,
Talking about the land, they're talking. That's why.
okay, but Levi, you got to get into the rabbinic reading. You're caught, and I appreciate you're caught that it's a little more forced on the plain sense, but that doesn't bother the rabbis. Rabbis see midrash as the way to read, so they can read. This is their tradition how to read that verse. So what I'm asking in a substantive sense, is there a difference? Just to elucidate, imagine if you had a king from Yehuda for sure is good, and from a Levite is for sure bad. But what happens if you have a king from Naphtali or Binyamin? So what's the difference between these two opinions?
It falls in between. Well, no, the
He's
first one.
not allowed to be, he cannot be it.
It can't be according to both opinion or one opinion.
No, the second can give you all of them, the first one.
Exactly. Okay, so in other words, just to clarify, there is a difference between these two interpretations. Everybody agrees that a priestly monarch is a problem. But why is it a problem? The first explanation is because monarchy belongs to Judah. The second explanation is because priests are disqualified from being monarchs. That's a different explanation. Okay, and it's conception. So practically, there's a difference. Let's say you have a king from Naphtali, again, in a theoretical world. According to the first, that would also be problematic because kingship belongs to Judah. According to the second is, no, there's just one tribe that's disqualified. Who's the disqualified tribe? Levites, priests. But you could have, let's say, from Naphtali or from Benjamin. But also conceptually, it's interesting, right? According to the first, in other words, just think just use the analogies, like constitutionally to be the president, Article 2, right? You have to be a natural born citizen, right, of the US. So there's certain prerequisites. So they're saying, the first opinion is saying to be qualified constitutionally as a king, you have to be Judah, you have to be Judean. While the second one, it's not a qualification, it's a disqualification. That the Levites and priests are disqualified. Now, then we could ruminate and conjecture why. Why are they disqualified? And we could say, so any thoughts? Why would the Levites and priests be disqualified?
Because the Kohen cannot be a.
But why? You're just repeating that a Kohen cannot be, but I'm asking why. At least conjecture. We're free. You could throw out any idea, we're free, but maybe because they're a spiritual authority and they shouldn't be involved in temporal matters and in political matters. Maybe because they're not rooted in the land territorially in the way other tribes. I mean, we could think of different rationales. I think it's tempting to sort of look at another passage here from Philo. Okay, Philo is not the rabbis, and so this is not going to really be the explanation for the Jerusalem Talmud, but conceptually, it's an interesting passage, I think, to look at on its own, and maybe to juxtapose. Philo, who's Philo? Just a review. Philo is this, I'm partial to Philo, I think he's this brilliant thinker. He lived in Alexandria at the end of the 1st century BC into the 1st century CE. sort of parallel to the times of Jesus, but he's living in Alexandria. And he is the leading brilliant Jew of Alexandrian Jewry, which is a major center of diaspora Jewry. And he writes a lot. He's a graphomaniac. He wrote a ton, and we have a lot of his writings, all in Greek. And here we're looking at translation. In this passage, he's dealing with the following fascinating issue, which is, why did Moses not appoint a successor, and why didn't his sons, become dynastically, always loaded questions of, especially when you have a charismatic, to use Bavarian terms, Moses was so charismatic, so who's gonna take over? And we know the Torah deals with that issue with Joshua. But the question is, why Joshua? Why not his sons, right? That should have been, you would think, a pretty, traditional answer that the sons inherit. So he says the following interesting thing. At all events, Moses, had no lack of virtuous and pious nephews. In other words, he talks about, I skipped. He says his sons weren't worthy. So that's why they didn't take over. They didn't inherit because they weren't qualified. Okay, we don't know the whole political power play and drama according to Philo, but he says they weren't fit. But wait a second, but he had nephews. And then his nephews were high caliber. How do we know? Because who are his nephews? That's Aaron's sons. Okay, that's really this week's parsha, right? About Nadav, Avihu, Elazar, Tamar. They seem to have 4 very talented sons. And then we know he has a grandson who's talented, Pinchas. So why couldn't they take over? That's the fascinating question that Philo asks. So Moses, had no lack of virtuous and pious nephews who were indeed already invested with the high priesthood as a reward for their virtue. Okay, that's the way Philo understands. He says, why did they become high priests? Because they were virtuous. So if they were virtuous, shouldn't they have been natural successors to Moses? But perhaps he did not think fit to draw them away from the divine ministrations which belonged to their office, or as was very likely considered that it would be impossible for them to attend to both matters, the priesthood and royal authority. Just parentheses, Philo seeing Moses as a type of a king. Okay, so he's saying, well, Moses is a king, and his successor, Joshua, is going to be a king. And the problem with his nephews they are high priests. And as high priests, they're focused on divine ministrations, and it's actually impossible to succeed at both tasks. The one which the appointment professes to be devoted to the worship of God, the other to the government of and the care of providing for men. Pretty fascinating passage in Philo. Now, I'm not sure the rabbis need to concur with this on a few grounds. Is it true that a king is so just political? Maybe kings also, that's what I was saying, that maybe with mentioning the Messiah and other figures. I mean, is King David just a political figure, or is he supposed to be a spiritual figure? Philo's really, and again, Philo's living end of 1st century BC into 1st century C. He's living in an imperial world, and he's sort of understanding the king very much as a political head. And he's saying that's different than, let's quote unquote, the church or the temple, right? And it doesn't work well to conflate temple and state. That's what Philo is saying, right? And I'm saying, actually, just to return to the Jerusalem Talmud might actually have an echo of Philo in its second explanation. The second explanation says priests are disqualified to be king. And maybe that's sort of deeper rationale, because priests are functionaries in temple. They're devoted to church or temple, right? And they should not, that's a bad shidduch when they get involved in the business of state. But the first explanation says, no, constitutionally, who's qualified to lead the state? Only the tribe of Judah. Comments?
But Moses was the first, but it's like divinely ordained. Moses was the first priest.
Yeah.
He had certain duties that he did the first day, anointing Aaron and the boys, and that was it. He was out.
For Moses acting as priest, fair enough.
For Moses acting as priest. So if God wanted him to be priest and king, he wouldn't have needed Aaron.
Sorry, just 1 second. We need the share screen again. if Moses, you were talking about Moses initially, doesn't only briefly serves as high priest.
Right.
Right.
God wanted the priest and the king to be in one person.
Right.
He had Moses.
Right.
But Moses was only over there.
Oh, you're saying that the Torah corroborates Philo's theory, because the Torah knows Moses as a leader. I don't know if we would think like Philo that he's just a political leader, but he's not the priest. It's true, briefly, he introduces the cult, but then it's very clearly handed off to Aaron. So that seems to support this sort of later Jewish idea that it's best to divide. Would you call it a division of church and state, though? That I'm not sure. In other words, the analogies are interesting. Maybe even within a religious polis, let me use that language, there still might be an advantage to differentiating between functions. In other words, maybe you have the high priest, and that's different from the leader who's not just a political leader, maybe a political and spiritual leader. And I'm getting a little more complex, but I hear the point. I think you're right that in the Torah, there's this interesting analogy. Okay, hopefully we'll get that. Let's take one more comment, and hopefully we'll get the PowerPoint back.
Ultimately,
Yeah.
even Moses had to turn to someone to hold up his arms.
Yeah.
Or were the two individuals who did hold up his arms? In other words, I think personally, from what I'm seeing, that really don't the two not have to be the same individual, but that they mesh in some way to be able to support each other in whatever their duties are. But don't forget, each one has separate responsibilities as well as separate prohibitions.
Right.
As well. That's
Right.
the other-
Interesting comment that maybe there's certain stories that support the other way. Okay, so what I want to now just let's think together. Oh, I wanted just to point one other source. I'll say it out loud and hopefully we'll see it together in a second. There's this interesting scholar. I want to introduce you to a scholarly theory. I just want to sort of round out these points by a scholarly theory that I think is over here. Yeah. Okay, so listen to this, like a conspiracy theory of scholars. And this conspiracy theory of scholars, actually, Gedaliah alone was a brilliant Hebrew professor a generation ago, and he's rebutting this conspiracy theory. But there's a conspiracy theory in his title, which is, did the Jewish people and its sages cause the Hasmoneans to be forgotten? And the idea is that the Hasmoneans, for all their achievement for a period of time, maybe in the eyes of rabbis were considered to be problematic. So maybe the rabbis found a way to sort of ignore the Hasmoneans. Okay, this is a scholarly conspiracy theory, and he explains some of the grounds for the scholarly conspiracy theory. He says, for example, think of the holiday we just celebrated. We celebrated the holiday of Purim. And if you look in the Mishnah, there's an entire tractate devoted to Purim. It's called Megillah. But it's very strange. Why is there no tractate in the Mishnah devoted to Hanukkah? That's odd. Like, why not? Hanukkah is pretty important, right? It's longer than Purim. So why is there no tractate? Now, that's a good question. I think that's actually a pretty good question. So the scholarly theory is, and this is an old scholarly theory, that the rabbis were uncomfortable with the Hasmoneans. And while, of course, they note the Hasmoneans, they don't spotlight the Hasmoneans. So he wonders then, why don't they spotlight the Hasmoneans? And he gives, one of the explanations is the following. A common scholarly theory is that sages and the people during the Second Temple period tried to erode the memory of the Hasmoneans. Why? Pharisees, and he means by that also rabbis, opposed monarchy in general, and especially non-Davidic monarchy. That the scholars had issues with monarchy, that the rabbis had issues with monarchy. They weren't into monarchy and they weren't into Davidic monarchy. They were critical of monarchy and they were critical of non-Davidic monarchy. So what do you think about that based on our Mishnah? What do you think about that in our Mishnah? Does that resonate with our Mishnah or not? Yeah, thoughts? Go ahead.
I think Rick Davis Hansen wrote a book about stuff like this.
Okay.
That you're in a period of time where something nasty has to be done.
Yeah.
And there's nobody else there to do it. They fall into it, they do the dirty work. Then afterwards, you can't wait to get rid of them.
Yeah.
Where was the Davidic line when Israel needed them with the Greeks? Why was there no descendant of Yehuda to do the fight instead of the Hashmonaim?
Okay, where were they? You're saying they sort of dropped the ball. Where were they? And therefore, you're pro-Hasmonean.
I mean,
The comment, just for those who are following online, was the following. It's an interesting comment. The comment is that there's good reasons to be sympathetic with the priestly monarch because they stepped up and they fought the fight against the Greeks, and the Judeans did not. So doesn't that give legitimacy to the priestly monarchs? And okay, interesting. But we could understand maybe from the eyes of sages who are maybe less activists that they could look back and say, okay, but that's inconsistent with the model of the Torah and the model of the Bible, etc. So I want to just to sum up. Let's sum up, but I want to sum up by still going forward one step, and that's what can we learn from our Mishnah? From our Mishnah, let's just go by our Mishnah. What's the relationship between king and high priest? So on the one hand, they're different figures. On the other hand, would you say that there's an anti-monarchic thrust in our Mishnah? I mean, we haven't read all our Mishnah, but do you think there's a legitimacy to royalty? Just to make sure everybody's with me. Let me review for 1 minute where we are. We're learning chapter 2 of Sanhedrin. We're using it as a springboard to learn about rabbinic politics. And what we're trying to learn about rabbinic politics is that there seems to be a very prominent role for the judiciary. That's Sanhedrin chapter 1. We're almost taking that for granted. We're not even talking about tonight. Now we're talking about the two figures we encounter in chapter 2, and that's the king and high priest. And with the king and high priest, that I said before we sort of do a compare and contrast, we should pause and note something. They're different people. And even though at first blush that might seem obvious, actually, if you think about it, it's not obvious. Because during Hasmonean times, the king was a priest, and the priest was the king. And it's not just a certain period of Jewish history that was true. Throughout Western history, we know that there is this sort of tension. How much should the person, especially when we're in a system when there's one person in charge, how much should they control all dimensions? Even in a modern world where we're sort of committed to separations of church and state, sometimes there's sort of a magnetism and a gravitating towards sort of trying to, take on control. I mean, just think about it as rally politics. Sometimes the rabbis try to take a, sometimes we have a real hard time with that. But a rabbi who will wade into politics and what should happen, and sometimes the opposite. Sometimes you have a political figure who will have a strong take on how religion should unfold. So even in modern times, there's tension, and certainly in an ancient world, and all the way through a medieval world into an early modern world, there were often, I think, these moments, and they weren't so brief. Sometimes they were powerful movements where the king tries to be in charge of the church too, or other versions of that. And I gave some examples of that. So it's interesting to think when we're talking about Talmudic politics, what is going to be the attitude of the rabbis overall to unifying versus separating, right? It's a very fundamental question that we're addressing. It's not just a historical question reacting to Hasmoneans. It's also a fundamental principled question. So now at the very end, so we saw different things. We saw that there are, people who look at the Hasmoneans as a, just inherently problematic, constitutionally problematic. And we see others like Maimonides, interestingly, who sees in the union something positive. I'm not saying he thinks that that's the only way to go, but I think he finds something compelling about the union. And we could understand why there might be something, if it's not abused, why there might be something to it within a religious political system. But largely, I think we see discomfort, just to summarize. And that's interesting, right? It's not obvious. In a modern world where church and state, where we're dealing with a secular public square, and even we want to be a society that is tolerant and even supportive of religion, we might say best to keep them apart. But that's very not obvious when we're returning to a religious tradition in a pre-modern world. So here's a surprise in our analysis. It's not obvious, but there seems to be this tendency towards keep the domains separate. The clearest passage we saw in point is the Jerusalem Talmud, which says priests cannot be kings. Now, of course, the Jerusalem Talmud knows that there were priests who were kings, the Hasmoneans. But the Jerusalem Talmud says that's problematic. Why? We saw two different explanations. Either because kingship in a positive sense belongs to Judah, or because in a negative sense, priests are entering into a domain that is, they're disqualified. Why? Here we look to Philo to add some texture, which I think is an interesting texture, where Philo says these priests are focused on the spiritual, not the political, and the meddling and the conflating those two domains is going to lead to not good. It's not a good shidduch. It's not a good synergy. Okay, so then at the very end, let me just get to the very end. I just introduced, and maybe here I got a bit complicated, but I find it so interesting, and that's this scholarly theory that Gedalia Alon's rebutting. The scholarly theory is that the rabbis in general, as much as they know Hanukkah, of course, and Hanukkah is a big deal, they sort of hide the heroes behind Hanukkah. That's the scholarly theory. They celebrate the miracle of the oil, they celebrate the candles, they celebrate the temple, but the heroes behind, they sort of don't talk so much about. And the scholarly theory is, one, the claim that that's true, and two, that that's deliberate. Now, scholars have challenged both those two claims, but let's just understand the claim for a second. They ignore Hasmoneans because they have an issue with Hasmoneans. Why? So here, the arguments we saw is because, first of all, the rabbis aren't into monarchy, period. That's the claim, the scholarly claim. That they're not into monarchy, they're into other things. So they're into, I don't know, collective rule, they're not into monarchy. And the second claim is that they're definitely not into non-Davidic monarchy or priestly monarchy. That's a scholarly theory. Now, Alon, the great Gedalia Alon, if you haven't heard his name, I'm very happy that tonight you are, because he was a brilliant scholar of rabbinic Judaism in the last generation. So Gedalia Alon writes this article and rebuts these claims. I just want to, just rounding out this portion of tonight, I want to use our Mishnah to think about, just based on our Mishnah, is it plausible, these two claims, that one, the rabbis are against monarchy, and two, that the rabbis are against priestly monarchy. And here I would actually differentiate between those two claims, because Mishnah Sanhedrin seems to talk about monarchy, and it seems to sort of validate monarchy. We will continue to learn it as our series goes on. But I think at least when you read Mishnah Sanhedrin, I don't see that they're trying to write off or marginalize or replace the monarch with a democracy or a senate or a republic or whatever other alternate system. They seem to be talking about the ideal blueprint of Jewish politics, Talmudic politics, and they talk about a court, and they talk about a high priest, and they talk about a king. So if they're not into kingship, why are they recognizing king? Let me just finish the point. But the second claim, that the rabbis were uncomfortable and not into the union of priesthood and monarchy, that I think does resonate with this chapter. That claim I think does resonate with this chapter. So I'm just saying, I sort of am sympathetic based on Mishnah Sanhedrin to the idea that the rabbis, when they looked to the Hasmoneans, saw a moment of unifying which they were uncomfortable with. And constitutionally, they thought best to keep those as separate offices. Of course, in the Mishnah, they're not just separate, and we'll hopefully get back to this either later tonight or next time. They're actually opposite offices, right? We saw high priest rules, judges and his judge, testifies and testifies, and king not all those things. So they're really differentiating. It's not just two different offices, it's offices that are regulated. It's almost, you can't be the same person, right? In the Mishnah, you cannot be the high priest and king because you're qualified to judge or you're not qualified to judge. You have immunity or you don't have immunity. They're opposite offices in the Mishnah. So they really seem to, I think, harden or ossify, if we use the fancy word, the distinction between these two offices. Okay, so if some of the details were a little subtle, the overall point, the message I want you to walk away with, I think, if our analysis is correct, is that Mishnah Sanhedrin really does seem to separate and distinguish between monarchy and high priesthood. Okay, let's move forward. Yes.
The last line, it says in parentheses, the bracket.
I'm sorry. I don't want to. You're excellent, but you're looking at a page I didn't mean to pause on. Very good. I'm hiding it from you. Okay. So now I want to briefly turn to this. I'm looking at the clock, but so let me just say where I want to. Let me go 5 more minutes. So the other question is, if there are different offices, is there a hierarchy among them? Back to that Tosfot issue is, can we say that who's number 1 and who's number 2 and who's number 3? Is there a hierarchy? Who's the most important? I already showed my cards that I think the Sanhedrin is the most powerful and the most important. But who comes second and who comes third if we had to rank them in terms of order of significance? So we saw the Tosafos. Tosafos said king is more important than high priest, right? And it's very interesting. By the way, if I didn't know this Tosfot, if you just stopped me, having gone to shul for numerous years, and you'd ask in the Jewish tradition, well, who's more important, the high priest or the king? I personally thought the high priest, no, because Judaism's religious, and it seems to be focused on its traditions and on its religious rites. And I would think a high priest is the most important religious official. So I would have thought, yeah, even if there's a king, that king's doing what I would think internally within the sort of the values is certainly important. It's running a state. I'm not saying we could frown on that. We know how important it is. But I would think within a religious tradition, it's not as important. So for Tosafos to say that the king's more important than the high priest is interesting, not obvious. You sort of want to ask Tosafos, but he's too short over here. He's too brief. Like, more important in what way? Like, in what metric exactly do you mean more important? Do you mean in terms of like what? Do you mean in terms of like power? Do you mean in terms of like, well, I don't know, if we have to fund institutions, who gets priority? Like, what do you mean more important exactly? And I'm not sure Tosafos or does he just mean in the sense of honor? Often this plays out in honor in terms of who comes first in terms of something. So just to go with this briefly, and maybe we'll have to sort of just start this, but there's, for example, this very famous midrash that maybe some of you have heard, at least outside. Here, the question of hierarchy. If you recognize in my photo, I mean, it's hard to see, but this is a diagram of some of the great, again, I'm using Western tradition examples of the investiture controversies, the controversies between Pope and Emperor in medieval times, where we know there were famous clashes. We talked about Charlemagne around 800, where he tries to unite and be both the head of the emperor and empire and also the most important spiritual figure. But over time, there's major tensions between Pope and Emperor, with a few moments of eruption, famous moments of eruption. So that's one of this is one of the paintings rendering some of those tensions, where you have, here's the emperor who's bowing to the Pope, right? That's Casanova, and to Gregory. This is, so yeah, related. So if you look in rabbinic tradition, here we have the following story. This is a midrash, so it's later than the Mishnah. But the midrash tells a very famous story based on the Bible, on the book of Judges. In the book of Judges, there's this disturbing episode where Jephthah takes a pledge before fighting the Ammonites. And he says, whoever's first to leave my house, I will pledge to God. And in the tragic tale of Judges 11, his daughter walks out. After it's like a Greek tragedy. He pledges to God, if I win this battle, I will sacrifice whoever walks out first. It's really like a Greek myth, right? And the one who walks out first, tragically, after he defeats the Ammonites, is his daughter. So that's the painful and pretty terrible tale at the end. I mean, part of Judges 11 is this great victory, but then the end is very tragic. So the rabbis in their rabbinic speak, they sort of wonder, and this isn't really in the biblical text, but the rabbis say, isn't there a mechanism to repeal an oath? Like, okay, he took an oath, but he didn't, pledge. This is rabbinic, sort of midrashim. But they asked, why couldn't he just annul or get his oath annulled? So the rabbis actually add another level of pathos, of tragedy to the story, and they say it all had to do with egos. Yes, in theory, Yiftach, who was the ruler, a type of a king, could have gone to the high priest to annul his oath, but he had too much pride, and so did the high priest. Yeah. So when he saw her, he tore his clothes. That's Yiftach seeing his daughter. He could have annulled his oath by going to Pinchas, who was the high priest, but he said, "I'm a king. Shall I go to Pinchas?" And Pinchas said, "I'm a high priest, son of a high priest. Shall I go to this comer, to this Amaret, to the king?" And of course, this is, I think this is rabbinic imagination, but it's very real, right? This is a great example. It's like a midrash real. Well, this is so real. Okay, whether this is what played out between Pinchas and Yiftach is sort of not really important. We know this sadly has played out throughout history, where two leaders could have resolved things if they could find a way to work together, and there's too much egos and they don't find ways to get the solution because they're too competitive internally. But two, I am using this a little bit just to touch on this issue of, and who is right? Who should have gone to whom? Should one in the pecking order, is there a hierarchy, right? And we could think about this, of course, throughout, we could think about, in the parliamentary systems, how things work in terms of honor, but sometimes also in terms of voting or procedure or other things, right? How do things work? So here, this is sort of where this issue gets raised, and there are really sources in all directions. Maybe I'll just leave showing, let's just conclude with, well, let me just go 2 more minutes. I want to just, that way next time we can move forward. If you look here in some sources, you can actually find sources in both directions. Classic rabbinic Judaism, that there are texts in both directions. For example, there's a text that says very explicitly, a Tosefta, which is the same time the Mishnah, around 200 CE, a king precedes a high priest. So it sounds like the Tosafos, the same pecking order, right? The king is more important than a high priest, comes first. Actually, the context is, imagine that you had an official who got held captive, and you only had money to ransom one official. Who would you pick, right? That's just sort of the halachic way of getting to the heart of the issue. Who, if you only have funds to, God forbid, a terrorist takes leaders captive, who's the most important? Who comes first? And the Tosefta says, you pick the king before the high priest. Wow. Now, if we saw the whole Tosefta, you could see the whole Tosefta is a little more interesting, that it's not so black and white, but that line is black and white. On the other hand, you have a midrash that says, based on a verse, standing before Elazar, who was the high priest, before Elazar, the high priest, they shall stand. God allotted honor to Elazar. Even the king stands before him. So this is less sort of, that crisis issue of ransoming and redeeming. But here, at least in terms of a certain protocol, it sounds like everybody stands before the high priest. Even the king needs to go. So it sounds like in the Midrash, actually, Yiftach, you should have gone to the high priest. That was wrong. Yeah?
The context in which they
context. Yeah.
They
both have standing.
In a different context.
That the context
One is
matters.
dealing with the spiritual, one is dealing with the more earthly, the more.
Yeah. So they each have standing. So
Is it really, is that a fair?
A comparison. Fair enough.
There's no equivalency.
Yeah, so I think Maimonides, let's just, if it's okay, let's just see one last text, and then if you want to make comments at the end, if it's okay. I just want to get in one text. I'm looking at the hour. I think Maimonides, he's a mouthful here, and it's sort of touching on this. It's a very interesting Maimonides. It deserves more parsing, and I don't want to parse it so carefully. I just want to show you how Maimonides actually gets into this issue of, it's the issue of, in diplomacy or dignity or showing protocol, and he sort of wonders who needs to come to whom. And Maimonides actually addresses this in a paragraph which is more intricate than one would imagine, right? He doesn't have that simple explanation. One goes to the other. Let's read a little bit. When he desires, he's talking about the king, right? The nation must present themselves before him. And that was the king could summon any person to, this is what my mind says normally, halachically. And they should stand before him and prostrate themselves to the ground. Even a prophet must stand before the king and prostrate himself on the ground. However, a high priest need not come before the king unless the high priest, desires to do so. So the king cannot summon the high priest. The high priest need not stand before the king. Rather, the king stands before the high priest, and that he quotes actually the verse that we just saw in the last midrash, and he shall stand before Elazar the high priest. Nevertheless, it is a mitzvah for the high priest to honor the king by having him seated and standing in his presence when he visits him. The king should only stand before him, the high priest, when he consults. The Urim and Thummim, that's a mouthful. And Maimonides sort of wants to have it all ways. And it's sort of fascinating. And I was in my mind, they're also different figures, but to sort of figure out even the diplomacy, even the gestures, right? So it's fascinating stuff. Yeah.
But this deals with protocol.
It's dealing with
It
protocol.
still doesn't really.
Get to the heart of the issue.
It doesn't deal with the crucial value judgment.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah, fair enough. And you sort of wish my mind said, okay, but you have to pull the trigger on an important issue. Who comes first? Who gets to decide? You know, and that's a fair question. And my mind here doesn't address that clearly enough. So let's just sum up what we saw tonight is we use the Mishnah as a springboard to really get into, I think, interesting political issues. One is the ideal within Talmudic politics to unify church and state or to keep them separate? But with important note that the state, I think in the Talmud is not a secular place. Okay, that's very important to remember that, which makes it more fascinating that the Mishnah wants separation, even though the state is a religious place. And the second point was just sort of, is there a hierarchy between, because go back to the Philo says the high priest, they're dealing with the spiritual, and the king, even within religious system, is dealing with the more temporal. So who's more important? And we don't totally have answers in the sources, but we wonder whether there's some type of a hierarchy. Tosafot says that the king is chashuv, more important than the high priest. So then we saw sources, but I share Dr. Rose's sort of frustration that the sources seem to talk more about protocol and dignity. And here we see sources go in different directions. And then Maimonides' sort of complex formulation now in this sort of diplomatic arrangement, there's sort of mutual gestures and limits to their gestures. Okay, next time we will move forward with other issues. So see you next Tuesday night.
By the way,
I'll look at the chat for anybody who's still on.
Rabbi,
Yes.
well, what I think, now for all
Yeah.
the fact that they were against, well, not Greeks per se, but you know, what they emulated in terms of like the newness, the competitions and all that. But it's interesting, the fact that they were actually, I was wrong on the second, but the fact that Greek was the only legitimate language
Yeah.
outside of
Yeah.
Hebrew.
That's interesting.
That you could use, legitimate meaning halakhically legitimate, to be used for reading.
Right, right.
And
That is
fascinating.
interesting.
So there's a recognition of, if you will, not exactly power, but certainly the fact that they basically ruled the Mediterranean, the Greeks.
Yeah.
At least at that point, I guess. I mean, I don't know when the Greeks took over, because, or when the Romans took over. What's interesting, by the way, the time when Philo lived, wasn't he there at the time that the Alexandria Library was destroyed by Julius Caesar?
I have to double check.
Julius Caesar was,
He is around that time, but I don't remember the destruction of him.
I just have to read, you know, I was
Yeah.
just trivia.
Okay,
questions.
interesting.
Significant Trivia questions, and one of them had to do with him destroying the library. at
Yeah,
Alexandria,
interesting.
Which is like, I mean, first of all, just destroying the library. But actually, that's significant too. It's destroying the thinking.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, everyone.
Are you running? Just want to tell you.
All right.
I did.